The sound of shouting echoed through the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs as Isaac Hayes dismounted his chestnut stallion, his eyes narrowing at the commotion unfolding outside the general store. A crowd had gathered, their attention fixed on a slender woman being roughly handled by the town sheriff and his deputy. Her dark hair tumbled in wild disarray as she struggled against their grip, defiance etched across her face despite the precarious situation. "Caught her red-handed this time, Sheriff Dawson," someone called out from the crowd. The sheriff, a barrel-chested man with a salt and pepper mustache, tightened his grip on the woman's arm. "Finally nabbed the notorious Ruby Blackwood. Been stealing across 3 counties for months now." Isaac paused, one hand on his saddle horn, watching with growing interest. He'd heard tales of the elusive female thief since arriving in Arizona territory 2 months prior, but the stories hardly matched the woman before him. She didn't look like the hardened criminal folks made her out to be. Instead, there was something in her eyes, a fierce determination that spoke of deeper motives than simple greed. "I didn't steal anything," Ruby protested, her voice carrying across the street to where Isaac stood. "Check my pockets if you don't believe me." "Already found what we need," the deputy sneered, holding up a silver pocket watch. "Mr. Hollister here says this belongs to him." A well-dressed man stepped forward from the crowd, nodding vigorously. "That's my grandfather's timepiece. Noticed it missing not 20 minutes after she left my office." Isaac frowned, feeling the familiar tug of instinct that had kept him alive through years of riding the dangerous trails of the West. Something didn't sit right about the accusation. The woman Ruby held herself with too much dignity for a common thief. Before he could consider the wisdom of his actions, Isaac found himself crossing the street, dust rising from each boot step as he approached the gathering. The crowd parted slightly as he neared, perhaps responding to the confident set of his shoulders or the unmistakable outline of the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Sheriff," Isaac called out, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. "Mind if I have a word?" Sheriff Dawson turned, annoyance flashing across his weathered face. "Who might you be, stranger?" "Isaac Hayes. Arrived in town a couple months back." He tipped his hat respectfully, aware that all eyes, including Ruby's, had fixed on him. "I couldn't help but notice the commotion." "What evidence do you have beyond Mr. Hollister's word?" The sheriff's expression darkened. "This ain't your concern, Hayes. The Blackwood woman's reputation speaks for itself. Half the merchants in town have reported missing items when she's been around." Ruby's eyes, a startling shade of green, locked with Isaac's. "I've never stolen anything in my life," she declared, though her words were directed at him rather than the sheriff. There was something in her gaze, a silent plea for belief that struck him unexpectedly. "Then how do you explain this?" The deputy dangled the silver watch. Isaac stepped closer, examining the timepiece without touching it. "Might I ask where exactly you found this watch, deputy?" The lawman hesitated, glancing at the sheriff. "It was in her possession, on her person," Isaac pressed. "It was on the ground near her feet when we apprehended her," the sheriff admitted grudgingly. Isaac nodded thoughtfully. "Convenient, wouldn't you say? A known businessman accuses a woman folks are already suspicious of, and evidence appears at her feet in a crowded street." Mr. Hollister stepped forward, his face reddening. "Are you calling me a liar, Cowboy?" "Not at all," Isaac replied calmly. "Just suggesting that in a town eager to blame someone for their troubles, evidence ought to be more substantial before dragging a lady off to jail." Ruby's expression shifted, slightly surprised, perhaps, at finding an unexpected ally. The sheriff's grip on Ruby's arm tightened. "This isn't your concern, Hayes. The law in Cottonwood Springs is my jurisdiction." Indeed it is, Isaac agreed. Which is why I'm prepared to post bail for Miss Blackwood, pending a proper hearing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ruby's eyes widened in genuine astonishment. There's no bail set yet, the sheriff protested. Then I'll speak with Judge Wilson about it directly, Isaac countered. Unless you're planning to deny her due process. The challenge hung in the air. Sheriff Dawson was many things, but even he knew better than to openly flout the law in front of half the town. After a tense moment, he released his grip on Ruby's arm. Fine. She's remanded to your custody until the hearing 3 days from now. But if she flees town, it's your hide I'll come for, Hayes. Isaac nodded solemnly. Understood. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, grumbling with disappointment at being denied their spectacle, Ruby turned to face her unexpected savior. Her wrists bore red marks from the sheriff's rough handling, but she held herself with unmistakable dignity. Why would you do that? She asked quietly, wariness evident in her posture. You don't know me. Isaac adjusted his hat, squinting against the afternoon sun. Let's just say I've seen enough false accusations in my time to recognize one when I see it. You're either very foolish or very kind, Ruby replied, a hint of a smile softening her features. Either way, I'm grateful. Don't be grateful yet, Isaac cautioned, glancing toward the sheriff's retreating back. You're still facing charges, and this town seems mighty convinced of your guilt. Ruby's expression hardened. They've been convinced since the day I arrived. A woman traveling alone might as well wear a sign that says suspicious character in these parts. Well, Isaac said, offering his arm hesitantly, for the next 3 days you're not alone. I suggest we find somewhere to discuss your situation more privately. The Cottonwood Cafe serves decent coffee, if you're amenable. After a moment's hesitation, Ruby placed her hand lightly on his arm. Lead the way, Mr. Hayes. It seems I'm in your custody now. As they walked down the main street, Isaac could feel the stares of the townspeople following them. He just aligned himself with the most notorious woman in Cottonwood Springs, a decision that would undoubtedly complicate his quiet existence here. Yet watching Ruby walk beside him, her head held high despite the whispers that followed, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Something told him there was far more to Ruby Blackwood's story than anyone in this town had bothered to discover. The Cottonwood Cafe was mercifully half empty when they entered, though the few patrons present didn't bother hiding their curious stares. Isaac guided Ruby to a corner table, positioning himself so that his back was to the wall, an old habit from years on the trail. A tired-looking waitress approached, her expression souring when she recognized Ruby. We don't serve her kind here, she said flatly. Before Ruby could respond, Isaac spoke up. 2 coffees, please, and whatever pie you've got fresh today. The waitress hesitated, looking between them. Miss Blackwood is under my supervision by order of Sheriff Dawson, Isaac added, his tone pleasant but firm. I'd hate to have to explain to him why we were refused service. With obvious reluctance, the waitress nodded and walked away. You'll find yourself quite unpopular if you continue associating with me, Ruby observed, removing her worn gloves and placing them on the table. Popularity has never been my priority, Isaac replied with a slight smile. Now, perhaps you'd care to tell me why half the town is convinced you're a master thief, Ruby sighed, absently tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. It began about 3 months ago. I came to Cottonwood Springs seeking work as a seamstress. I have considerable skill with a needle and thought a growing town might need such services. And they didn't welcome the competition. Mrs. Fielding at the dress shop certainly didn't, Ruby confirmed. But it was more than that. A week after I arrived, Mr. Thornton claimed his gold pocket watch went missing after I'd visited his store. I never touched it, but he was convinced. Then it was Mrs. Wilson's silver brooch, Mr. Peterson's cash box each time. Something would disappear shortly after I'd been in the vicinity. The waitress returned with their coffee, practically slamming Ruby's cup down before hurrying away. "And you were never caught in the act?" Isaac asked, adding a spoonful of sugar to his coffee. "Never," Ruby said firmly, "because I never committed the acts. But in a town like this, once suspicion takes hold." She shrugged eloquently. "I should have left after the first accusation, but I'm stubborn, and—" She hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "I have nowhere else to go." Isaac studied her across the table. Her clothes, while simple, showed evidence of careful mending. Her hands, though delicate, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work. Nothing about her suggested the easy living of a successful thief. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "I rent a small room above the laundry. Mrs. Chen is one of the few people in town who doesn't think I'm stealing everything that isn't nailed down." A wry smile touched her lips, probably because she has even less social standing than I do. Isaac nodded thoughtfully, considering their options. "The hearing is in 3 days. Until then, we need to find evidence to clear your name." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Hayes, you've already risked your reputation by speaking up for me today. I wouldn't ask you to do more." "You didn't ask," Isaac pointed out. "I offered. And since I've put myself forward as responsible for you, it's in my best interest to ensure you're exonerated." Ruby studied him for a long moment, as if trying to discern his true motives. "Why are you really helping me, Mr. Hayes? Most men want something in return." Isaac met her gaze steadily. "My father taught me that a man's character is revealed by how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. I don't believe you're a thief, Miss Blackwood. That's reason enough." A hint of color touched Ruby's cheeks. "Then I'm fortunate you happened to be present today." "Perhaps it wasn't entirely chance," Isaac replied with a slight smile. "I've heard tales of the mysterious Ruby Blackwood for weeks, I must admit to some curiosity. And now that you've met the notorious thief in person." There was a challenge in her tone. Isaac took a deliberate sip of his coffee before answering. "I think I've met a woman who's been made a convenient scapegoat for this town's troubles. The question is, who benefits from your disgrace?" Ruby considered this, her finger tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I've wondered that myself. The theft started shortly after I arrived, but they've continued even when I've been nowhere near the location." "Yet no one seems to notice that discrepancy," Isaac observed. "It's as if they want to believe you're guilty." "It's easier to blame the outsider," Ruby said softly. "I learned that lesson young." Something in her tone suggested a deeper story, but Isaac didn't press. Instead, he pulled out a small notebook from his vest pocket. "Let's make a list of the thefts you've been accused of. Perhaps there's a pattern we're missing." For the next hour, they methodically documented each incident. Ruby could recall dates, locations, stolen items, and witnesses. The picture that emerged was troubling. While the early thefts seemed random, the more recent ones targeted specific individuals with increasing value. Mr. Hollister's watch today was the most valuable item yet, Ruby noted. "And unlike the others, I was actually arrested this time." "The stakes are escalating," Isaac agreed, tapping his pencil against the notebook. "Almost as if someone is growing bolder or more desperate." As evening approached, the cafe began to fill with the dinner crowd. The stares directed their way grew more numerous and less subtle. "We should go," Ruby suggested, noticing the hostile glances. "I've caused you enough trouble for one day." Isaac nodded, leaving payment on the table. As they stepped out into the street, the setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty road. The evening air had cooled considerably, and Ruby pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'll walk you to your lodgings," Isaac offered. "That's not necessary," Ruby protested. "I've managed on my own this long." "I've no doubt of your capabilities, Miss Blackwood," Isaac replied with a hint of amusement. "But as I'm technically responsible for ensuring you appear at the hearing, I'd like to know exactly where you're staying." Ruby gave him a measured look, then nodded. "Very well. It's this way." They walked in companionable silence for several minutes, turning off the main street onto a narrower lane lined with modest buildings. The Chinese laundry stood at the far end, its windows glowing with lamplight despite the late hour. "Mrs. Chen works until midnight most days," Ruby explained. "Her son helps when he's not in school." As they approached the building, Isaac noticed a figure lurking in the shadows of the alleyway beside it. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster. "Miss Blackwood," he said quietly, "step behind me." Ruby tensed but did as he asked. "What is it?" Before Isaac could answer, the figure stepped forward into the dim light cast by the laundry windows. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, with nervous eyes and a worn hat clutched in his hands. "Miss Ruby," the young man called softly. "I heard what happened today." Ruby relaxed slightly. "It's all right, Mr. Hayes. This is Jim Anderson. He works at the livery." Jim nodded respectfully to Isaac, but kept his attention on Ruby. "I wanted to tell you I don't think you took Mr. Hollister's watch. I was sweeping outside the livery when I saw him talking with someone before he went accusing you." Isaac stepped forward. "Who was he talking to, Jim?" The young man twisted his hat nervously. "I couldn't see clear. They was in the shadow of the bank building, but they was arguing something fierce. Then not 10 minutes later, there's all that commotion about you stealing his watch." He looked at Ruby apologetically. "I should have spoken up, but—" "But you need your job," Ruby finished for him, understanding in her voice. "I don't blame you, Jim. This could be important," Isaac said. "Would you be willing to tell the judge what you saw?" Jim's face paled. I can't, sir. My ma depends on my wages if word got back to Mr. Hollister." Isaac nodded grimly. Hollister was clearly an influential man in town. "I understand, but if we find more evidence, would you confirm what you've told us tonight?" After a moment's hesitation, Jim nodded. "If you can prove she's innocent some other way, I'll back you up. Miss Ruby's always been kind to me and my ma." "Thank you, Jim," Ruby said softly. "That means a great deal." The young man gave a quick nod before disappearing back into the shadows, clearly eager to avoid being seen with them. "Well," Isaac remarked as they continued to the laundry's entrance, "it seems you do have friends in town after all." Ruby's smile was tinged with sadness. "The working folk have always been kinder to me than those who consider themselves my betters." They reached the side door that led to the rooms above the laundry. Ruby paused, key in hand, and turned to face Isaac. "Thank you for today, Mr. Hayes. Not many would have done what you did." "Isaac," he corrected gently. "If we're going to clear your name, we might as well be on familiar terms." Ruby hesitated, then nodded. "Isaac, then, and you should call me Ruby." "I'll come by in the morning," he said. "We have work to do if we're going to uncover the truth before your hearing." "I'll be ready," she promised. Then, with a surprising show of vulnerability, she added, "Please be careful. Whoever is behind these thefts clearly doesn't mind if I take the blame. They might not appreciate your interference." Isaac touched the brim of his hat. "I've faced worse than small-town schemers, Ruby. Get some rest." As he walked back toward the main street where he'd left his horse, Isaac reflected on the day's unexpected turn. He'd come to Cottonwood Springs seeking a quiet place to lay low after years of wandering. Instead, he'd embroiled himself in a local conspiracy and taken responsibility for a woman the entire town seemed determined to condemn. Yet, despite the complications, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. There was something about Ruby Blackwood, a quiet strength, an unwavering dignity in the face of persecution that called to something deep within him. Something he'd thought long buried beneath years of hard living and solitude. Isaac retrieved his horse from the livery and rode slowly toward his small cabin on the outskirts of town. As the stars emerged overhead, he found himself wondering what Ruby's smile might look like if it weren't shadowed by worry, and realizing with some surprise that he was determined to find out. Dawn broke over Cottonwood Springs in a blaze of orange and gold, the desert landscape coming alive with the first rays of sunlight. Isaac had risen early, an ingrained habit from years of trail life, and prepared for the day with methodical precision. The list he and Ruby had compiled lay on his small table, annotated with his observations from the previous night. After a simple breakfast, he saddled his horse and rode into town, planning his approach. If they were to clear Ruby's name, they needed more than just Jim Anderson's reluctant testimony. They needed to identify the actual thief or thieves and understand the purpose behind the crimes. The town was already stirring when he arrived at the Chinese laundry. A few early risers cast curious glances his way as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. Mrs. Chen was already at work, visible through the window as she pressed a shirt with practiced efficiency. Isaac knocked at the side door, and moments later, Ruby appeared. She was dressed simply in a blue calico dress, her dark hair neatly braided and coiled at the nape of her neck. Despite the circumstances, she had an understated elegance that caught him off guard. "Good morning," she greeted him, a tentative smile touching her lips. "You're prompt." "Time is something we don't have in abundance," Isaac replied, returning her smile. "I thought we might begin by revisiting some of the locations where thefts occurred. People are often more forthcoming in the morning before the day's troubles set in." Ruby nodded, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "Where shall we start?" "The general store," Isaac decided. "Mr. Peterson's cash box was one of the first items stolen, correct?" "Yes, about 3 months ago," Ruby confirmed as they began walking. "He accused me of distracting him with questions about fabric while someone else emptied his strongbox." "And was there someone else in the store at the time?" Ruby's brow furrowed in concentration. "Yes, several people. It was market day and the store was busy. I remember Mrs. Fielding from the dress shop was there, and the banker's wife. Oh, and Deputy Collins was picking up tobacco." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "The same deputy who helped arrest you yesterday." "The very same," Ruby confirmed. "He's never made a secret of his dislike for me. Called me uppity when I corrected his assumption that I was looking for work as a laundress rather than a seamstress." They reached the general store just as Mr. Peterson was unlocking the front door. The shopkeeper's welcoming expression soured when he spotted Ruby. "We're not open yet," he said curtly. "Actually, Mr. Peterson, we'd like a word," Isaac said, stepping forward. "It's about the theft of your cash box a few months back." Peterson's eyes narrowed. "What's to discuss? Everyone knows she was involved." He jerked his chin toward Ruby. "That's what I'd like to clarify," Isaac pressed. "You said the box was taken while Miss Blackwood distracted you. Were there others in the store who might have had opportunity?" The shopkeeper hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direct questioning. "It was busy that day." "Market day always is." "So there were multiple people who could have accessed the strongbox," Isaac persisted. "I suppose," Peterson admitted grudgingly, "but she was the stranger in town, and things only started going missing after she arrived." Ruby spoke up, her voice calm despite the accusation. "Mr. Peterson, I understand your frustration at losing your money, but I give you my word, I had nothing to do with it." The shopkeeper snorted. "Your word doesn't mean much around here, Miss Blackwood." One more question, Isaac interjected before Ruby could respond. How many people knew where you kept your strongbox? Peterson paused, caught off guard by the question. Well, I never advertised it, but it wasn't exactly a secret. It was under the counter. So a local would be more likely to know its location than a newcomer, Isaac observed. The shopkeeper's expression hardened. I don't appreciate what you're implying, Hayes. We never had trouble until she came to town. I'm not implying anything, Isaac replied evenly, just gathering facts. Thank you for your time. As they walked away from the increasingly agitated shopkeeper, Ruby sighed. That went about as well as expected. Actually, it was informative, Isaac countered. He admitted others had opportunity and that a local would be more likely to know where to find the strongbox. But he's still convinced I'm guilty, Ruby pointed out. For now, Isaac agreed, but we're just getting started. Throughout the morning, they visited several other businesses where thefts had occurred. The pattern was consistent shopkeepers and business owners reluctant to consider any suspect but Ruby, despite circumstantial evidence at best. By midday, they had made little progress beyond confirming what they already suspected. The town had decided Ruby's guilt before giving her a fair hearing. They stopped for lunch at a small eatery on the edge of town, where the proprietor, a widow named Mrs. Bennett, was less hostile than most. As they ate simple sandwiches in the shade of the establishment's small porch, Isaac reviewed his notes. There's something connecting these thefts beyond your presence, he mused. The items taken are diverse jewelry, money, documents, timepieces, but they all have significant value. Ruby nodded thoughtfully. And almost all the victims are among the town's more prominent citizens. Except for Mrs. Chen, Isaac pointed out, referencing their list. You mentioned her son's prize jade figurine disappeared. That's right, Ruby confirmed. About a month ago. She was devastated. It was a family heirloom. But unlike the others, she never accused me. She even offered me tea to console me when she heard people were blaming me. Isaac tapped his pencil against the notebook. The Chinese laundry seems out of pattern with the other targets. Unless. Unless what? Ruby prompted when he fell silent. Unless it wasn't about the value of the item but about something else entirely. He looked up at her. We need to speak with Mrs. Chen. When they returned to the laundry, they found Mrs. Chen sorting linens, her movements quick and practiced despite her advancing years. She greeted Ruby warmly and Isaac with cautious respect. Mrs. Chen, might we ask you about the jade figurine that was stolen? Isaac inquired after pleasantries were exchanged. The older woman's face fell slightly. My son's tiger, very old, very valuable, been in family many generations. I'm sorry for your loss, Isaac said sincerely. Can you tell me if anything unusual happened around the time it disappeared? Mrs. Chen considered the question. Week before men come, say need land for new hotel. Offer little money. She made a dismissive gesture. I say no, my husband build this place, is mine. Isaac and Ruby exchanged a significant look. These men, Ruby asked carefully, did they mention who they represented? Man named Hollister, Mrs. Chen replied. He come back twice more. Last time very angry. Next day tiger gone. Isaac felt a surge of excitement. Mr. Hollister, the same man who accused Ruby of stealing his watch yesterday, Mrs. Chen nodded. Same man. Very important in town now. Not so important when first come 5 years ago. As they left the laundry, Isaac's mind was racing. Hollister's name keeps surfacing. He accused you directly yesterday, and now we learn he was pressuring Mrs. Chen to sell her property before the theft. Ruby's expression was troubled. You think he could be behind all of this? But why frame me specifically? Perhaps you were simply convenient a newcomer without connections, Isaac suggested. Or perhaps there's more to it. What were your interactions with Hollister before yesterday? Ruby thought for a moment. I met him shortly after arriving in town. He owns the bank and several other properties. He offered me a position as his housekeeper, but something about the way he looked at me. She shuddered slightly. I declined as politely as I could. And how did he take the rejection? Not well, Ruby admitted. He implied I was being foolish to refuse his generosity given my uncertain situation in town. Isaac's jaw tightened. So he had a personal grievance against you from the start. But orchestrating a series of thefts just to discredit me seems extreme, Ruby countered. There must be more to it. I agree, Isaac said. And I think it has something to do with property. Mrs. Chen mentioned a hotel. Let's find out what Hollister is planning. Their inquiries led them to the town's small newspaper office, where the editor, a bespectacled man named Wilson, was working on the weekly edition. A hotel, Wilson repeated when Isaac asked. Yes, there's been talk of a grand hotel and gambling hall on the east side of town, supposed to bring in travelers from the new railroad spur they're building. Who's behind the development? Isaac pressed. Hollister's the primary investor, along with a few businessmen from Phoenix, Wilson explained, warming to the topic. It's quite the ambitious project. They've been buying up properties along that whole block for months. Including the Chinese laundry, Ruby asked. Wilson nodded. That's the hold-up from what I hear. The laundry sits right where they want the main entrance, but the old woman won't sell. He adjusted his spectacles. Can't say I blame Hollister for being frustrated. It's a lucrative opportunity for the town. As they left the newspaper office, the pieces were beginning to fit together. Hollister wants Mrs. Chen's property, Isaac summarized. She refuses to sell. Shortly after, her prized possession disappears. And the other thefts, Ruby questioned. How do they connect? Isaac considered this as they walked. What if they're not all committed by the same person? What if some are genuine thefts and others are fabricated accusations? Ruby's eyes widened with understanding. A mixture of real and false allegations would make the pattern harder to discern. Exactly, Isaac agreed. And if Hollister is behind some or all of them, he'd need help, someone with access, someone people trust implicitly. Like a deputy sheriff, Ruby suggested quietly. Isaac nodded grimly. We need to tread carefully. If we're right, we're dealing with powerful men who won't appreciate our interference. As the afternoon waned, they compiled their findings, building a case that increasingly pointed to Hollister as the orchestrator of at least some of the incidents. But suspicion wasn't proof, and they needed concrete evidence before the hearing. There's one place we haven't checked, Isaac said as twilight approached. Hollister's office at the bank, if he's keeping records of his development plans or anything connecting him to the thefts. Ruby looked alarmed. You're not suggesting we break in? Not break in, Isaac clarified, but perhaps visit after hours for a more thorough conversation than he'd permit during business hours. That sounds dangerously close to the very crime I'm accused of, Ruby protested. Isaac smiled slightly. The difference is, we're not going to take anything. We're just going to look. Despite her reservations, Ruby agreed to the plan. They waited until after sunset when the streets grew quieter and most businesses had closed for the day. The bank, a solid brick building at the center of town, stood dark except for a light in the back office. He's still there, Isaac observed from their vantage point across the street. That might work to our advantage. Wait here. Before Ruby could protest, Isaac crossed the street and approached the bank's front door. Finding it locked as expected, he moved to the side of the building and knocked firmly on the window of Hollister's office. After a moment, the banker appeared, irritation evident on his face as he recognized Isaac through the glass. With obvious reluctance, he came to the side door and opened it slightly. Hayes, isn't it? What do you want at this hour? Isaac adopted an apologetic expression. Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Hollister. I wanted to discuss Miss Blackwood's situation privately without the entire town listening in. Hollister's eyes narrowed. There's nothing to discuss. She's a thief who'll finally face justice at tomorrow's hearing. That's just it, Isaac pressed. I've been looking into the matter and I'm concerned there might be a misunderstanding. Perhaps if we could speak inside. After a moment's hesitation, Hollister stepped back. 5 minutes, no more. Isaac slipped inside, taking quick stock of the office. A large desk dominated the space, covered with papers and ledgers. Behind it, a painting hung slightly askew, potentially concealing a safe. I'll be direct, Isaac said, positioning himself where he could see the desk. Several witnesses have come forward with information that contradicts the accusations against Miss Blackwood. Hollister scoffed. What witnesses? The town is unanimous in its assessment of that woman's character. Not quite unanimous, Isaac countered. For instance, young Jim Anderson from the livery saw you arguing with someone shortly before you accused Miss Blackwood of stealing your watch. A flicker of unease crossed Hollister's face before he composed himself. Anderson, that half-wit boy, he's hardly a reliable witness. Perhaps not alone, Isaac agreed. But when combined with Mrs. Chen's account of your pressure tactics regarding her property and the curious timing of thefts following your rejected business propositions. He let the implication hang in the air. Hollister's expression hardened. You're making dangerous accusations, Hayes. I'm merely noting patterns, Isaac replied mildly, his eyes catching sight of a document on the desk, a map of the proposed hotel development, with the laundry property clearly marked as acquisition pending. Your time is up, Hollister snapped. I suggest you leave before I have Sheriff Dawson arrest you for harassment. Isaac nodded, having seen what he needed. Of course, but I'll be at the hearing tomorrow, Mr. Hollister, and I think Judge Wilson will find my evidence quite compelling. As he turned to leave, Hollister called after him. Hayes, a word of advice. Cottonwood Springs takes care of its own. Outsiders who stir up trouble tend to regret it. Isaac paused at the door. Is that a threat, Mr. Hollister? Consider it friendly guidance, the banker replied with a cold smile. Good evening. Outside, Ruby was waiting anxiously in the shadows. What happened? She whispered as they quickly moved away from the bank. I confirmed our suspicions, Isaac replied quietly. Hollister is definitely behind the hotel development, and he's desperate to acquire Mrs. Chen's property. And when I mentioned Jim Anderson witnessing his argument before your arrest, he was notably concerned. But we still don't have proof he orchestrated the thefts, Ruby pointed out. No, Isaac admitted, but we have enough to raise serious questions at the hearing, and Hollister knows that he all but threatened me. Ruby's face paled in the moonlight. Isaac, perhaps we should stop. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. He turned to face her, surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. Ruby, I've faced worse threats than a small-town banker with delusions of grandeur. Besides, he hesitated, then continued more softly. I find I'm rather invested in seeing justice done for you. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of growing connection that transcended their short acquaintance. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. They turned to see Deputy Collins walking toward them, his hand resting suggestively on his holster. Evening, Miss Blackwood. Hayes. His tone was deceptively casual. Sheriff asked me to remind you that the prisoner is supposed to remain at her lodgings unless accompanied by her custodian. We're just returning there now, Deputy, Isaac replied evenly. Collins's gaze shifted between them, suspicion evident. See that you do. Wouldn't want the judge to think she was planning to flee before the hearing. As the deputy continued his patrol, Ruby and Isaac exchanged concerned glances. "We need to be careful," Isaac murmured. "I wouldn't put it past Hollister to arrange some evidence of your attempted escape." "I won't give them any excuse," Ruby promised. "I'll stay at Mrs. Chen's tonight and go directly to the courthouse in the morning." Isaac nodded. "I'll come for you at 9. The hearing is at 10. When they reached the laundry, Ruby paused at the door. "Isaac, thank you. Regardless of what happens tomorrow, knowing someone believed in me, it means more than I can express." On impulse, Isaac took her hand. "This isn't over, Ruby. I won't let them railroad you on false charges." She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face and caught at something in his chest. "Good night, Isaac." "Good night," he replied softly, watching as she disappeared inside. As he walked back to retrieve his horse, Isaac reflected on the day's discoveries and on the unexpected turns his life had taken since stepping into Ruby's defense. Tomorrow would bring the hearing and, he hoped, justice, but it also carried risk. Hollister had resources and influence, and if their suspicions were correct, he wouldn't hesitate to protect his interests. For the first time in years, Isaac found himself deeply invested in something beyond his own survival. The realization was both unsettling and strangely exhilarating. Whatever came tomorrow, he knew with certainty that meeting Ruby Blackwood had irrevocably changed his path. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and hot, the Arizona sun already beating down mercilessly by the time Isaac rode into town. He'd spent a restless night reviewing their evidence and planning their approach. While they had built a compelling case for reasonable doubt, they still lacked the definitive proof needed to clear Ruby's name entirely. As promised, he arrived at the laundry at 9 to escort Ruby to the courthouse. She emerged dressed in her finest clothes, a modest dark blue dress with a white collar, her hair neatly arranged. Despite the simplicity of her attire, she carried herself with a dignity that immediately drew his eye. "You look." Isaac paused, searching for the right words. "Ready for battle." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "In a manner of speaking, I suppose I am." Mrs. Chen appeared behind her, pressing a small package into Ruby's hands. "For luck," she said firmly. "You good person, truth will win." Ruby thanked her with genuine warmth before turning to Isaac. "Shall we?" They walked toward the courthouse, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Word of the hearing had spread throughout town, and it seemed everyone wanted to witness the proceedings. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, a sizable crowd had gathered. Sheriff Dawson stood at the entrance, his expression grim as they approached. "Quite the spectacle you've created, Hayes," he commented. "Half the town's here to see the outcome." "Justice should be a public affair, Sheriff," Isaac replied evenly. Inside, the courtroom was already filling with spectators. Judge Wilson, a severe-looking man with a trimmed white beard, sat at the bench reviewing documents. At a table to the left sat Hollister, engaged in quiet conversation with a well-dressed man Isaac assumed was his lawyer. "That's Franklin Morris," Ruby whispered, confirming his suspicion. "The most expensive attorney in the county." They took their places at the right-hand table. Unlike Hollister, they had no legal representation, a fact that clearly amused the banker, judging by his satisfied expression. At precisely 10 o'clock, Judge Wilson called the court to order. "We are here to determine if sufficient evidence exists to try Ruby Blackwood on charges of theft and larceny," he announced. "Mr. Morris, you may present the prosecution's case." Morris rose smoothly, adjusting his vest before addressing the court. With practiced eloquence, he outlined the series of thefts that had plagued Cottonwood Springs over the previous months, emphasizing the common denominator: Ruby's presence near each crime scene. Furthermore, Morris continued, Miss Blackwood was apprehended 2 days ago in possession of Mr. Hollister's valuable family timepiece, the final, irrefutable evidence of her criminal activities. When Morris concluded, Judge Wilson turned to Isaac and Ruby. Do you have a response to these allegations? Isaac stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Your Honor, the prosecution has presented a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence and town gossip. We intend to demonstrate that Miss Blackwood has been deliberately framed for these thefts as part of a larger scheme orchestrated by Mr. Hollister. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Hollister's face darkened with anger. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hayes, the judge warned. I assume you have evidence to support it. We do, Your Honor, Isaac confirmed. With your permission, I'd like to call our first witness. To everyone's surprise, including Ruby's, Isaac called Mrs. Chen to testify. The elderly laundress made her way to the front of the courtroom, her back straight despite her years. After being sworn in, she recounted her story: Hollister's repeated attempts to purchase her property, his increasing anger at her refusals, and the subsequent theft of her son's jade figurine. And did you ever suspect Miss Blackwood of taking the figurine? Isaac asked. Never, Mrs. Chen stated firmly. She good person, helped me many times, no reason to steal. Morris rose to cross-examine. Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that your advancing age might affect your memory of events? Perhaps you've confused the timeline. Mrs. Chen fixed him with a stern gaze. My body old, mind still sharp, I remember perfectly. Next, Isaac called several other witnesses who testified to Ruby's character and to inconsistencies in the theft allegations. A young mother described how Ruby had mended her children's clothes for free when she couldn't afford payment. The school teacher confirmed that Ruby had been helping at the school during one of the alleged thefts. Finally, with some trepidation, Jim Anderson took the stand. The young man twisted his hat nervously as he recounted seeing Hollister in a heated argument with Deputy Collins shortly before Ruby's arrest. They was arguing fierce-like, Jim testified. Then not 15 minutes later, there's all that commotion about Miss Ruby stealing the watch. Morris's cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to undermine Jim's credibility by highlighting his youth and suggesting he might have been mistaken about the identity of the men or the timing. But Jim held firm, his simple honesty compelling despite his nervousness. As their final evidence, Isaac presented the map he'd seen in Hollister's office, which he'd sketched from memory showing the planned hotel development with Mrs. Chen's laundry prominently marked as a key acquisition. Your Honor, Isaac concluded, we've demonstrated that Mr. Hollister had both motive and opportunity to orchestrate these events. His development plans are stalled by Mrs. Chen's refusal to sell. By creating an atmosphere of theft and insecurity in that part of town, he likely hoped to pressure her into reconsidering. And in Miss Blackwood, he found a convenient scapegoat, a newcomer without family or connections, who had previously rejected his unwanted advances. The courtroom had grown increasingly tense during Isaac's presentation. Hollister's face was flushed with barely contained fury, while Deputy Collins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Wilson regarded Isaac thoughtfully. Your theory is interesting, Mr. Hayes, but largely circumstantial, much like the case against Miss Blackwood. There is one more piece of evidence, Your Honor, Ruby said suddenly, rising to her feet. With your permission. The judge nodded, and Ruby opened the small package Mrs. Chen had given her earlier. From it, she withdrew a jade figurine, a tiger, exquisitely carved and obviously valuable. This morning, Mrs. Chen found this hidden in a stack of linens returned from the Grand Hotel which Mr. Hollister owns, Ruby explained. It appears someone was careless in their attempt to dispose of evidence. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Hollister half rose from his seat, his expression thunderous. "This is absurd," he protested. "She could have put it there herself." "Mrs. Chen can testify that these linens were collected from the hotel yesterday and only unpacked this morning," Isaac countered. "Miss Blackwood has been under supervision since her arrest." Judge Wilson called for order as excited conversation broke out across the courtroom. After examining the jade figurine himself, he conferred briefly with Sheriff Dawson. "This court finds insufficient evidence to proceed with charges against Miss Blackwood," the judge finally announced. "The case is dismissed." Relief washed over Ruby's face as scattered applause broke out among the spectators. Isaac placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, sharing in her vindication. "Furthermore," Judge Wilson continued, "I am ordering an investigation into the allegations made against Mr. Hollister and Deputy Collins. Sheriff Dawson, please ensure that both men remain available for questioning." As the crowd began to disperse, Hollister pushed past them, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Hayes." Isaac met his gaze steadily. "I've had worse, Mr. Hollister, much worse." Outside the courthouse, well-wishers surrounded Ruby, offering apologies and congratulations. The tide of public opinion had turned remarkably quickly once her innocence was established. "People are fickle," Ruby observed as they finally extracted themselves from the crowd. "Yesterday a thief, today a heroine. The truth has a way of changing perspectives," Isaac replied, guiding her away from the courthouse toward the quieter end of the street. "What will you do now?" Ruby considered the question. "I'm not sure. Continue my seamstress work, I suppose. Though I wonder if Cottonwood Springs holds too many difficult memories now." "You could leave," Isaac suggested, watching her carefully. "Start fresh somewhere else." A shadow crossed her face. "Perhaps, though running has never solved my problems before." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Isaac spoke again. "I have a small ranch about 10 miles north of here. Nothing grand, just a cabin and a few acres, but it's peaceful. Good place to think about next steps." Ruby glanced at him, a question in her eyes. "Are you inviting me to visit?" "I'm suggesting it might be safer than staying in town, at least until the investigation into Hollister is complete," Isaac clarified, though they both recognized it wasn't the entire truth. "And I find I'm not quite ready to say goodbye to Ruby Blackwood just yet." Color touched her cheeks. "That's very kind of you, Isaac, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," he assured her. "It's a beginning, if you want it to be." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of possibilities neither had anticipated 2 days earlier. "I'll need to collect my things," Ruby said softly, "and thank Mrs. Chen properly." Isaac nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I'll wait." As the sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, Isaac Hayes stood watching Ruby speak with Mrs. Chen, their heads close together in earnest conversation. Despite the dangers they'd faced and the uncertain future ahead, he felt lighter than he had in years. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the cowboy and the woman everyone had called a thief. And if anyone asked why he'd risked so much for a stranger, he knew exactly what he'd say. She'd stolen his heart first. The 10-mile journey to Isaac's ranch passed quickly despite the heat of the day. Ruby rode beside him on a gentle mare borrowed from the livery, her few possessions packed in saddlebags. As they left the town behind, Isaac watched her gradually relax, the tension she'd carried for months visibly easing from her shoulders. "It's beautiful out here," Ruby observed as they traversed rolling grasslands punctuated by stands of juniper and pine. So open and free. That's why I chose it, Isaac replied. After years on the trail, I wanted space to breathe but didn't want to be too far from civilization. How long have you had your ranch? About 6 months, Isaac said. I won the deed in a poker game in Tucson. The previous owner was eager to head to California for the timber boom. He smiled slightly. His impatience was my good fortune. Ruby studied him with curious eyes. You don't strike me as the settling down type. I wasn't, he admitted. For a long time, staying in one place felt too confining. But a man gets tired of waking up in different towns, never knowing a soul. The honesty in his voice resonated with something in Ruby. I understand that feeling, she said softly. I've been moving from place to place since I was 17. Isaac wanted to ask what had started her wandering life, but something in her expression suggested the time wasn't right for such questions. Instead, he pointed ahead to where the land rose gently. We're almost there, just over that ridge. As they crested the rise, Isaac's ranch came into view, a modest spread nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it. A sturdy log cabin stood near a cluster of cottonwood trees, with a corral and small barn nearby. A few cattle grazed in the distance, and a vegetable garden was visible beside the cabin. It's not much, Isaac said, suddenly self-conscious, but it's mine. Ruby's face softened as she took in the scene. It's wonderful, Isaac, so peaceful. They rode down into the valley, and as they approached the cabin, a border collie came bounding out to greet them, barking enthusiastically. That's Scout, Isaac explained as he dismounted. He keeps the coyotes away from the chickens and reminds me to come home when I've been in town too long. Ruby laughed as the dog circled their horses, tail wagging furiously. He's certainly dedicated to his welcome duties. Isaac helped her down from the mare, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. The contact, though brief, sent a ripple of awareness through both of them. Thank you, Ruby said, stepping back slightly, a flush coloring her cheeks. Isaac cleared his throat. Let me show you around. The cabin was simple but well constructed, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and a comfortable-looking armchair. A kitchen area occupied one corner, and 2 doors led to separate bedrooms. The previous owner built it for himself and his son, Isaac explained. The smaller room hasn't been used much, but the bed's comfortable enough. I changed the linens before we left town. Ruby turned to him in surprise. You were that confident I'd accept your invitation, Isaac smiled. Not confident, hopeful. After settling Ruby in the spare room, Isaac showed her the rest of the property, the barn with its 2 milk cows, the chicken coop, the small but productive garden. Throughout the tour, he found himself seeing the place through her eyes, noticing both its modest charms and its shortcomings. You've done well with it in just 6 months, Ruby commented as they returned to the cabin for supper. It already feels like a home. The simple observation warmed him unexpectedly. It's coming along, still plenty to do before winter. Inside, Isaac busied himself preparing a meal, a hearty stew he'd left simmering that morning before riding to town, accompanied by fresh bread from the baker's. Ruby insisted on helping, setting the table and slicing the bread while Isaac tended the stew. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing easily between them as the tension of the hearing gradually faded. Ruby shared stories of her travels through various territories, her work as a seamstress, and the interesting characters she'd met along the way. Isaac spoke of his years as a trail guide, the cattle drives he'd led, and his gradual decision to seek a more settled life. Neither delved too deeply into the darker chapters of their pasts. Yet there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of shared experiences that had shaped them in similar ways. After supper, they sat on the porch, watching as twilight painted the valley in shades of purple and gold. Scout lay at their feet, occasionally raising his head when night creatures rustled in the nearby brush. "You think Hollister will face consequences?" Ruby asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Isaac considered the question. "It depends on what the investigation uncovers. If Deputy Collins decides to save himself by testifying against Hollister, perhaps. But men with money often find ways to avoid justice." Ruby nodded, unsurprised by his assessment. "At least the town knows the truth now, that's something." "It is," Isaac agreed, "and Mrs. Chen can keep her laundry without fear of further harassment." "She's a remarkable woman," Ruby said fondly. "She offered me a partnership in the business, did you know? Said she's getting too old to manage alone and her son wants to study medicine in San Francisco." Isaac turned to her, surprised. "Are you considering it?" Ruby sighed softly. "It's a generous offer." "But after everything that's happened." She trailed off, gazing out at the darkening landscape. "You don't have to decide anything right away," Isaac reminded her. "Take some time here, clear your head." She smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Isaac, for everything." As the stars emerged overhead, a comfortable silence fell between them. The day's events had exhausted them both, and soon Ruby excused herself to retire for the night. Isaac remained on the porch a while longer, contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken in just 3 days. He'd risked his standing in the community for a woman he barely knew, challenged one of the town's most powerful men, and now invited her into his home. By any rational measure, his actions had been impulsive, perhaps even foolish. Yet sitting there in the quiet darkness, Isaac couldn't bring himself to regret any of it. There was something about Ruby that called to him a kindred spirit who understood the loneliness of always being the outsider, always moving on before connections grew too deep. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Isaac found himself hoping for something more permanent than the transient relationships that had characterized his wandering years. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. With a sigh, he finally rose and went inside, checking that the door was securely bolted before retiring to his own room. Despite his exhaustion, sleep was slow to come as his mind continued to circle around the woman sleeping across the hallway, and the future that now seemed full of unexpected possibilities. The days that followed settled into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Ruby, accustomed to making herself useful wherever she landed, integrated seamlessly into the daily routine of the ranch. She tended the garden, gathered eggs from the chicken coop, and quickly mastered the art of making cheese from the cow's milk. Isaac found himself enjoying her company more than he'd anticipated. She was intelligent and quick-witted, with an unexpected sense of humor that emerged as she relaxed in her new surroundings. They worked side by side during the days, sharing meals and conversation in the evenings. On the 4th day, Isaac rode into town for supplies and to check on the investigation. He returned with news that Deputy Collins had confessed to working with Hollister, admitting he had planted evidence in several of the thefts. Hollister himself had fled town, presumably heading for the territorial capital where he had political connections. "Sheriff Dawson says they'll bring him to justice eventually," Isaac reported as they sat at the kitchen table that evening. "But he's not optimistic given Hollister's resources." Ruby nodded, unsurprised. "At least the truth is known. That matters more to me than seeing him punished." "The sheriff also asked about you," Isaac added, watching her carefully. "Several people in town have been asking after your welfare." "Oh," Ruby's expression was guarded. "What did you tell him?" "That you're safe and considering your options," Isaac replied. "Mrs. Chen specifically wanted me to remind you that her offer stands." Ruby was quiet for a moment, absently tracing the grain of the wooden table with her finger. "It's strange," she finally said. "For so long, I've been used to moving on when things got difficult. Now I have options to stay either with Mrs. Chen or—" She glanced up at him, a question in her eyes. "Or here," Isaac finished for her, his heart rate quickening. "If that's something you'd want." "Is it something you want, Isaac?" Ruby asked softly. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he replied, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. "I know you're strong and resilient. I know you face adversity with dignity. I know you're kind to those who have nothing to offer in return." He paused, gathering his courage. "And I know that in just a few days, you've made this place feel more like a home than it has in the 6 months I've owned it." Color rose in Ruby's cheeks, but she didn't withdraw her hand. "I've enjoyed being here," she admitted, "more than I expected to." "Then stay," Isaac suggested. "Not forever if you don't want to, but long enough to see if this could be something worth building on." Ruby met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if looking for any sign of doubt or insincerity. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, for now." Isaac couldn't suppress his smile. "For now is a good start." The next morning, they rode together to check on the small herd of cattle grazing in the western pasture. The day was perfect, clear blue skies, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and pine, the sun warm but not oppressive. Ruby rode with surprising skill, explaining that she'd worked briefly on a horse ranch in Nevada some years back. As they crested a hill overlooking the valley, she reined in her mare and simply gazed at the panorama before them. "It's breathtaking," she said softly. "You chose well, Isaac." He looked at her, silhouetted against the vast sky, her hair lifted slightly by the breeze, and felt something shift within him, a certainty he hadn't expected to find. "I believe I did," he replied, meaning far more than just the land. Over the following weeks, their connection deepened. Isaac taught Ruby about ranch management, the rhythms of the seasons, the care of the animals, the maintenance required to keep everything functioning properly. In turn, she brought new energy to the place, expanding the garden, sewing curtains for the windows, and adding small touches that transformed the functional cabin into a true home. They spoke more openly about their pasts as trust grew between them. Isaac shared the loss of his family to fever when he was 20, his years drifting from job to job across the West, the near-death experience during an Apache raid that had made him reconsider his rootless existence. Ruby revealed her own story in pieces: her childhood in Chicago, her father's gambling debts that had left the family destitute, her flight westward at 17 when a creditor had demanded she marry him to settle her father's accounts. She spoke of the various towns and territories she'd passed through, always moving on when circumstances grew difficult or unwelcome attention threatened her independence. "I never stayed anywhere long enough to be more than a visitor," she confessed one evening as they sat by the fireplace. "It seemed safer that way." "And now?" Isaac asked. Ruby smiled, the firelight playing across her features. "Now I'm beginning to understand the appeal of putting down roots." Their first kiss came naturally, one evening as they stood on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Isaac had turned to comment on the beauty of it and found Ruby already looking at him, something vulnerable and yearning in her expression. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings, until Isaac gently cupped her face in his hands and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was tender at first, a careful exploration, but quickly deepened as weeks of growing attraction found expression. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ruby rested her forehead against his chest. "I wasn't looking for this," she whispered. "For you." Isaac stroked her hair, his heart full. "Sometimes the best things find us when we're not looking." Their relationship blossomed from that point, physical attraction complementing the emotional connection that had been building since their first meeting. They moved cautiously but deliberately, both aware of the significance of what was developing between them. In early October, they traveled together to Cottonwood Springs for the Harvest Festival. It was Ruby's first return to town since the hearing, and she was understandably apprehensive about the reception they might receive. Her concerns proved largely unfounded. Most townspeople greeted her warmly, many offering apologies for their previous suspicions. Mrs. Chen was particularly delighted to see her, insisting they stay for tea in the small apartment above the laundry. "You look happy," the older woman observed, studying Ruby's face. "Ranch life agrees with you." Ruby glanced at Isaac, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Yes, it does," Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Good. You deserve happiness, Ruby, both of you." As they prepared to leave town that afternoon, Sheriff Dawson approached them outside the general store. "Glad I caught you," he said, removing his hat. "Wanted to let you know that Hollister's been arrested in Prescott. Trial's set for next month." "That's welcome news, Sheriff," Isaac replied. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "I also owe you both an apology. Should have looked harder at the evidence instead of accepting the easy explanation." He turned specifically to Ruby. "Especially you, Miss Blackwood. Town did you wrong." Ruby acknowledged his apology with grace. "Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate your honesty." As they rode home in the golden afternoon light, Isaac noticed a new lightness in Ruby's demeanor. "Feeling vindicated?" he asked. "More like released," she replied thoughtfully. "As if the last piece of a burden has been lifted. I don't need to define myself in opposition to their accusations anymore." Isaac understood exactly what she meant. For both of them, the past was finally receding, making space for the future they were building together. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the valley in snow by mid-November. The ranch, prepared under Ruby's meticulous planning, weathered the season comfortably. The cabin was warm and well-stocked, the animals sheltered in the reinforced barn, the root cellar filled with preserved vegetables from the garden. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fireplace after a simple but satisfying dinner. Scout lay curled at their feet, occasionally twitching in his dreams. Outside, snow fell softly, muffling the world in pristine white. "I have something for you," Isaac said, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He held out a small wooden box hand-carved with delicate patterns. Ruby took it carefully, running her fingers over the intricate design. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Did you make this?" Isaac nodded. "Open it." Inside, nestled on a scrap of velvet, lay a ring, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that caught the firelight. Ruby's breath caught. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and something deeper. "It was my mother's," Isaac explained softly. "The only thing of value I kept after she passed. I've carried it with me all these years, not knowing why until now." He took her hand, his expression serious but filled with unmistakable love. "Ruby Blackwood, I never expected to find someone who would make me want to stay in one place for the rest of my life. But here you are. Will you marry me?" Tears glistened in Ruby's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Isaac slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. The wedding took place in early spring, when the valley burst into bloom and new life stirred everywhere. It was a small ceremony held on the ranch, with only a handful of guests: Mrs. Chen and her son, the schoolteacher and her husband, Sheriff Dawson, and a few others who had become friends. Judge Wilson, who had presided over the hearing that had brought them together, now officiated their marriage with evident pleasure. "It seems fitting," he remarked during the ceremony, "that justice has led not only to truth but to love." As Ruby and Isaac exchanged vows beneath an arch of wildflowers, both reflected on the unlikely path that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with an accusation of theft had transformed into the greatest gift either could have imagined: a partner to share life's journey, a love built on mutual respect and understanding, a home created together. At the small reception afterward, Sheriff Dawson approached them with a telegram. "This arrived yesterday," he explained. "Thought you'd want to know. Hollister's been sentenced to 10 years for fraud and conspiracy. Seems he had schemes running in half the territory." "Justice is served," Isaac remarked, his arm around Ruby's waist. "Indeed it is," the sheriff agreed, raising his glass. "To justice and to new beginnings." As the celebration continued around them, Isaac drew Ruby aside for a moment of privacy. "Any regrets, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked softly, still marveling at the change in her name. Ruby looked up at him, her eyes reflecting all the love in her heart. "Only that it took an accusation of theft to bring us together." Isaac smiled, touching her cheek gently. "Ah, but you did steal something, Ruby." "What's that?" she asked, returning his smile. "My heart," he replied simply. "From that very first day, and I have no intention of ever asking for it back." Ruby laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "Then we're even, Cowboy, because you've stolen mine as well." As they rejoined their guests, both knew with absolute certainty that what they had found together was far more valuable than any possession: a love born from adversity, strengthened by trust, and promising a future neither had dared to imagine before fate had brought them together in the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs. 5 years passed, transforming the modest ranch into a thriving operation. Under Isaac and Ruby's joint management, the property expanded to include additional grazing land, a larger herd of cattle, and an orchard that produced the finest apples in the county. The original cabin, though still cherished, had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Their son, James, now 4 years old, had his father's thoughtful nature and his mother's determined spirit. Their daughter, Elizabeth, just turning 2, was already showing signs of inherent stubbornness that made Isaac joke about the challenges they would face when she reached her teenage years. Ruby had established a small but successful dressmaking business, creating garments for clients from surrounding ranches and even from Cottonwood Springs. Her reputation for quality workmanship spread throughout the territory, bringing a steady stream of orders that she fulfilled in the bright sewing room Isaac had built as an addition to their home. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, they hosted a gathering for friends and neighbors, a tradition they had established after their marriage. The ranch yard was decorated with lanterns and wildflowers, tables laden with food prepared by Ruby and several neighboring women. Children played under the watchful eyes of older siblings, while adults exchanged news and shared stories. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s but still remarkably spry, sat in the place of honor. Her son had completed his medical studies and established a practice in Prescott, returning regularly to visit his mother, who continued to run the laundry with the help of a young Chinese couple who had recently arrived from San Francisco. As twilight softened the landscape, Isaac found Ruby standing alone near the corral, watching the celebration with a contented smile. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, handing her a glass of wine and putting his arm around her waist. 5 years, Ruby marveled, leaning into his embrace. Sometimes it feels like we've always been together, and other times I can't believe how quickly the time has passed. Isaac kissed her temple. Any regrets? It was a question he asked each anniversary, not from doubt, but as a reminder of how far they had come. Ruby turned in his arms, looking up at the face she had grown to love more deeply with each passing year. "Not a single one," she replied, the familiar response carrying all the certainty of her heart. "Though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in town that day." "I'd have found you eventually," Isaac asserted confidently. "Some things are meant to be," Ruby laughed. "Such a romantic, Mr. Hayes." "Only with you, Mrs. Hayes," he countered, pulling her closer for a proper kiss. Their moment was interrupted by James running up to them, his dark hair tousled and his eyes bright with excitement. "Pa, Uncle Chen brought candies from Prescott. Can I have one before supper?" Isaac ruffled his son's hair. "Ask your mother. She's the one who decides important matters like candy distribution." Ruby pretended to consider the request seriously. "I suppose one wouldn't hurt, but only one, mind you, and check on your sister while you're over there." James nodded solemnly before dashing back to the gathering, his mission approved. "He grows more like you every day," Ruby observed fondly. "God help us all," Isaac joked. "One stubborn Hayes man was probably enough for this territory." As the evening progressed, Sheriff Dawson, now semi-retired but still a regular visitor to the ranch, proposed a toast to the couple. "To Isaac and Ruby," he called, raising his glass. "Who proved that even in these wild lands, love can transform strangers into family and a piece of earth into a true home." "Hear, hear," came the response from the assembled guests. Later, as the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Isaac and Ruby stood together on the porch of their home, watching as lantern lights bobbed away into the darkness, neighbors returning to their own ranches and farms. Their children were already asleep inside, James in his own small bed and Elizabeth in the cradle that Isaac had crafted with his own hands before her birth. Scout, now elderly but still devoted, lay dozing at the threshold, his ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds. "I have something for you," Isaac said, reaching into his pocket. "An anniversary gift." He placed a small package wrapped in tissue paper into Ruby's hands. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a locket gold with intricate engravings that caught the light from the lanterns. "Isaac, it's beautiful," she breathed, opening it to find miniature portraits of James and Elizabeth inside. "Look at the inscription," he suggested. Ruby turned the locket over and read the words engraved on the back. "You stole my heart first." Tears sprang to her eyes as she recognized the phrase he had used to defend her all those years ago. "You remember what you said to the sheriff that day?" Isaac smiled, taking the locket and fastening it around her neck. "I remember everything about that day, Ruby. It was the day my life truly began." Ruby touched the locket, then reached up to caress his face. "Mine too, though I certainly didn't realize it at the time." "No." Isaac raised an eyebrow teasingly. "You weren't immediately captivated by the dashing cowboy who came to your rescue." "I was suspicious of your motives," Ruby admitted with a laugh. "Handsome men offering help usually wanted something in return, in my experience." "Well, I did want something," Isaac confessed, drawing her into his arms. "I wanted to see you smile without fear. I wanted to know the woman behind those guarded eyes. I wanted—" He paused, suddenly serious. "I wanted to be worthy of your trust." Ruby's expression softened. You are, every day in 1,000 ways." She stood on tiptoe to kiss him gently. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else would." "Thank you for staying," Isaac replied, for building this life with me, for our children, for everything." They remained on the porch a while longer, wrapped in each other's arms, watching as the last traces of sunset faded from the western sky and the stars emerged in all their brilliance. The ranch spread out before them, peaceful in the gathering darkness, a testament to what they had created together from unlikely beginnings. Both remembered the suspicion and hostility that had surrounded their first meeting, the accusations that had threatened to condemn Ruby to a fate she didn't deserve. Both understood how easily they might have missed this happiness if circumstances had unfolded differently. Yet here they stood, 5 years later, bound together by a love that had only deepened with time and trials. What had begun as a cowboy's defense of a falsely accused woman had blossomed into a partnership that sustained them, both a love story written across the vast canvas of the Arizona Territory, where second chances and new beginnings were still possible for those brave enough to seize them. As the night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, Isaac and Ruby Hayes held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the courage that had allowed them to recognize in each other the home they had both been seeking all along. In the years that followed, the Hayes Ranch became known throughout the territory as a place of warmth and welcome. Travelers spoke of the couple who had transformed a modest homestead into a thriving enterprise, their story of overcoming prejudice and false accusation repeated as an example of frontier justice and resilience. Their family grew with the addition of another son, Thomas, born in the 8th year of their marriage. The children flourished under their parents' guidance, James developing a natural aptitude for ranching, Elizabeth showing remarkable talent with horses, and young Thomas revealing early signs of his father's quiet thoughtfulness combined with his mother's quick intelligence. Ruby's dressmaking business expanded to include a small shop in Cottonwood Springs, managed primarily by a talented young apprentice, while Ruby oversaw the more complex creations from her sewing room at the ranch. Her designs became sought after throughout the territory, bringing additional prosperity to the family. Isaac, meanwhile, earned respect as one of the region's most knowledgeable cattlemen. His advice was frequently sought by neighboring ranchers, and he occasionally served as a judge at the territorial fair's livestock competitions. The skills he had developed during his years as a trail guide found new application in helping establish safer routes for cattle drives from the surrounding ranches to the railroad. Together, they weathered the challenges that life inevitably presented: drought years that threatened the herd, illnesses that swept through the community, the passing of beloved friends including Mrs. Chen, whose funeral was attended by nearly everyone from Cottonwood Springs in recognition of her quiet dignity and generosity. Through it all, their partnership remained the bedrock of their existence. They consulted each other on important decisions, supported one another's ventures, and continued to find joy in the simple pleasure of being together. Their love, tempered by experience and deepened by shared history, became a touchstone for their children and an example to their community. On their 15th anniversary, with their family and closest friends gathered once again to celebrate, Isaac surprised Ruby with news that he had purchased the old Hollister property in town, the building that had once housed the bank now owned by a respectable businessman from Phoenix. "What will we do with a building in town?" Ruby asked, bewildered by the unexpected acquisition. Isaac smiled, enjoying her surprise. "I thought it might make a proper location for your dressmaking business. The upper floor could be renovated into an apartment for when we need to stay in town during bad weather." Ruby's eyes widened as she considered the possibilities. "That's That's incredibly thoughtful, Isaac, but it must have cost a fortune. Consider it an investment in our future, he replied. And perhaps a bit of poetic justice. The man who once tried to destroy your reputation has unwittingly provided a foundation for your legacy. The irony wasn't lost on those who remembered the events of 15 years prior. Sheriff Dawson, now fully retired but still sharp-minded, raised his glass in appreciation of the symmetry. Full circle, he observed. From accused thief to respected businesswoman with the former accuser's property as your headquarters, the West may be wild, but justice finds its way eventually. Later that evening, as their guests departed and their children retired to bed, Isaac and Ruby stood together beneath the vast canopy of stars that had witnessed their journey from strangers to soulmates. 15 years, Isaac mused, his arm around Ruby's waist. If someone had told me on that day in Cottonwood Springs that the woman everyone was calling a thief would become the center of my world, I'd have thought they were touched by the sun. Ruby laughed softly, leaning into his embrace. And if someone had told me the handsome cowboy who spoke up for me would father my children and build a life with me that exceeded my wildest dreams, I'd have said they were spinning tall tales. Life is full of unexpected turns, Isaac agreed, turning to face her. In the silvery moonlight, he could still see traces of the young woman who had stood with such dignity against false accusations, but now those features were softened by years of happiness. The wariness in her eyes replaced by the quiet confidence of being deeply loved. Some turns are better than others, Ruby replied, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines that time had etched around his eyes. This one finding you was the best of all. Isaac captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. I told you once that you stole my heart first. It's still true, Ruby Hayes. After all these years, it's still just as true. Then we remain even, she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. Because you've had mine from the moment you believed in me when no one else would. As the moon traced its arc across the sky, casting its gentle light over the land they had nurtured together, Isaac and Ruby Hayes held each other close, grateful for the chance encounter that had changed their lives irrevocably. What had begun as an act of simple justice had blossomed into a love story that would be retold for generations, a reminder that even in the wild, untamed territories of the American frontier, hearts could find their true homes in the most unexpected of circumstances. And if travelers passing through Cottonwood Springs in later years noticed the elegant sign above the dressmaking shop that read Ruby Hayes, Proprietor, and asked about the woman behind the name, they would invariably hear the story of the falsely accused thief and the cowboy who had declared, with unwavering certainty, "She stole my heart first."